Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Wednesday. Chris, thank you. Thank you for well, if it sounds better audio wise, you are to be thanked for that. Chris Benson's been nice enough to hook me up with a sweet little mic to where I could hopefully sound a lot better, a lot more clearer, and then I can even just hear myself real time as well. And it seems to be working out fine. Alan's got his cool little teacher headset on, so I think we are good to go. It is Wednesday, so for those who are used to joining in a study that Alan and I lead, it is not Tuesday, it's not Friday, it is Wednesday, and we are excited to get back into our studies of walking through history. Alan had the good idea of beginning our study in beginning our study in Exodus after we've finished up with Genesis. We took a little bit of a break there so Alan could have a baby and get him a little acclimated into the schedule in the Seed and Strength house. And we're happy to hear that Lincoln is healthy and doing pretty well, and Melanie's doing well too. We're just so happy for them, and we're thankful to God for the blessing that they've been enjoying in Lincoln. But we are excited to get back here on this series of studies. Alan had the idea of beginning this study on a Wednesday night where most of our members have the opportunity to get on here and study with us, whereas they might not have that opportunity on Tuesday and Friday. We want to give them the opportunity to hop on here with us on Facebook and also on Zoom. For those who might not have Facebook, we want them to be able to at least hear us. What we're going to do for the main part of this study is Alan and I are just going to go back and forth as we're used to in our walking through history studies. And then we're going to, at the end, if anybody on our Zoom feed wants to ask questions or they have any comments, we'll let you do that then. But as we're going through on Facebook, as usual, if you have a comment or question, please feel free to post that on Facebook as per usual. Or if you're on Zoom and you want to drop a comment on the comment section, on the messenger section of Zoom, you could do that as well. But if you want to make a oral comment, just hold that off to the end and we'll open that up to that here as we finish up this evening. But thank you for joining us tonight. If you have not joined us in any of these studies, or we've been walking through history or walking through his story, the story of the Bible, while Alan and I have been doing, it's just making our way through the text. We're walking through the narrative story that we see in the beginning of the Bible, seeing where we come from and what God designed for us to do, and how that kind of got messed up in Genesis, or how that really got messed up in Genesis. And we've been working our way through the text, following the thread of God's promises throughout Genesis, the Abraham story, and the story of his family. We finished up a couple weeks ago at the end of Genesis, and now we are ready to begin our walk through the Exodus story. Lots of great content here in this book. Some incredible things take place in Exodus, but again, it's all about bringing resolution to the problems that were introduced in the book of Genesis. God redeeming us and restoring us to our rightful place, the place where he established us to be as his people, rulers of this planet, and people who reflect his image in all that we do. Alan, I'm excited to get into this text with you this evening, and excited to have all of those who are joining with us tonight, whether you are on Facebook or whether you are listening in on Zoom. Thank you for being here. One more thing I'll mention, Alan, before I'll let you say a few things. We are working on a YouTube channel, working on getting all of our previous episodes uploaded to a YouTube channel. And then the plan is to be able to live stream these studies not only to Facebook, but also to YouTube beginning on Friday. So that those who might not have a Facebook page, maybe you're here on Zoom tonight because you don't have a Facebook page and this is easier for you, we're going to share that link with our church family, and they can share that link with those who might want to watch on YouTube. So be looking out for that as well. We're trying to widen the nets of those who can see our broadcast as much as we can, and we hope that these studies will continue to be a blessing to many people. Alan, I've done a lot of talking. Welcome. It's good to see you this evening, and we are very happy to hear that everything is well in the Seed and Strength household.
I had this nice little pattern here. We had this study going every twice a week, and see, the past 2 weeks have seemed to be really long just because of everything that's happened. But yeah, we're doing really good. Lincoln's doing good. Annabelle's loving being a older sister. I can't get her to change any diapers yet, but or Melanie for that matter. But I guess Melanie did a lot of work already, so I gotta pitch in somewhere.
Yeah, whenever we pass by you guys at the Mexican restaurant, you guys are in your car waiting on your to-go order. I told Annabelle, Annabelle, you being a good big sister, changing diapers and everything. She's like, oh no, 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 no. I'm just doing big sister things. Like, oh, well, she's got this figured out already. She knows exactly what she's doing. She knows her role. And then Lincoln, I was like, oh, he's so cute. He's such a strong little baby. And Annabelle said, thank you, as if she has a lot to do with that.
She's claiming them for sure.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Hope that this study will be a blessing to you. Again, for those on Zoom, if you have any comments or questions, please just write them down, hold them for the end. And we'd love for you to make those comments or questions. And for those who are on Facebook, you are more than welcome to drop any comments at any time, any comments or questions. I do have the feed up with the comment section going, so I can see those and address those as we go along. We're trying to keep things going as smoothly as possible on a regular study, so things can go as best as they can. We're in Exodus chapter 1 this evening. Exodus chapter 1, I want to begin reading in verse 1, and we'll just do as we normally do, read the text, make some comments, and work our way through what we have here. The Bible says in Exodus chapter 1, in verse 1, that these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each came with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And I'm not sharing the screen. I just realized that. Let me get that up on here. Here we go. There we go. Now we're a little better. The text there for everybody to see. But everybody knows the song of the sons of Jacob, so we're good at that point. Picking up in verse number 5, the total number of Jacob's descendants was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation eventually died, but the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply further. And when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. Alan, as we come into the book of Exodus, it is this is one of those books where it is of the utmost importance that you don't begin here in a reading. If you pick up the Bible and for whatever reason you skip over Genesis and you come right to Exodus, you literally have inserted yourself into the middle of the story, and you are missing so much information that leads us to this point. As we've talked about, the way I've really described what's happening here in Exodus is that God has put his people in an incubator. He has brought them from the land of Canaan. He has brought them down to his place, and they are in this incubator where they can grow and mature and become strong until it's time for them to leave. And that's exactly what we see here in this story. And yet there are some difficulties that arise through their multiplying and growing strong. What do you have to say about what happens here in Egypt and the turn of events? Because while Joseph was alive, the Israelites were treated very well in Egypt. But once Joseph dies, once this new king, verse 8, comes into place, the atmosphere and the circumstances of the Israelites in Egypt, it changes dramatically.
You mentioned this would be a bad point to just jump in and start reading if you weren't familiar with the big picture of the Bible. And honestly, it's the same as if we were jumping in right in Matthew chapter 1, the first book, the first chapter of the New Testament. You would be so confused because there's a ton of names. And I think that just goes to show us that, the Bible as a whole is God's word. Yes, there's a difference between the old covenant, which we're going to be covering here soon, and the new covenant of Christ. There's a change there, but I think the necessity of having both of those written down for us is crucial. So here, in this case, right off the bat, chapter 1, verse 1, where you've got Israel mentioned, you've got Jacob mentioned, and all of his sons. Joseph's going to be mentioned. Clearly, this presupposes that you've already read Genesis and you've been following that story. This is all one. Just because we start a new book and start number 1 again with chapter 1, this is still the book of the law, the book of the covenant, the Pentateuch, as we call the first 5 books of Moses. All of this is supposed to go together. So yeah, you can't just jump in here and not have read Genesis already. And then of course you mentioned, Joseph. He was looking back to Genesis. He was the second in command in Egypt. Well, pretty rapidly that is forgotten about. And a new Pharaoh comes up who does not. I don't know. It says he doesn't remember Joseph. I don't know that that's just like I forgot about him as much as I refuse to acknowledge what he did. I mean, he saved their country. He should be remembered. I mean, he should be right up there with the George Washingtons and the Abraham Lincolns and all these great people from your whatever country you're from. He should have been remembered in Egypt, even though he's not not an Egyptian. But how quickly they forget the good that he did, and of course we know that the Pharaoh at the time puts them into slavery.
Right. One of the things that the CSB misses here in the text that Alter makes mention of in his translation, and the one things he really wants to key in on is with the CSB, it just begins, these are the names. But Alter in his translation, I believe Heiser makes note of this in his discussion on this text as well. There's a word there that is missing here in the CSB, and it's the word and, which grammatically isn't something that we do because you don't begin a sentence with and. That's just one of the things you don't do. It's one of those grammar rules.
Grammar no-nos.
Yeah, grammar no-nos. So all of our English teachers out there, just me saying that, I'm sure it makes them want to pull their hair out. But in Alter's translation, it does begin with, and these are the names of the sons of Israel. He makes note that this is important because this shows the connection between the previous book of Genesis and what we have here beginning in the book of Exodus, that this is, and the reader is to understand this as being a continuation of God continuing to fulfill his promises that he has made to the family of Abraham, that this is, in a sense, it's not because it is focusing on a new era, but it is Genesis part 2. It is this story continuing here in the Exodus, that there is the same wording. In fact, we can go back to Genesis 46 and beginning in verse 8, that these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt, Jacob and his sons. That's the same language that we have here in Exodus chapter 1 in verse 1. So showing that this is a continuation, that this genealogy in a sense, which Genesis 46 is really a genealogy. It gives all the family of Abraham. Here it's a much more condensed version, but that is to show us that this is a continuation, that this is not just randomly disconnected from the story, but this is a very strong continuation of the story. And what we have here in this story is the growth. And if we go back to the promises that were made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, the promises were, and we all know them well, the land promise, the nation promise, and the seed blessing promise. The land that they would come to possess, which we're going to see. The whole reason for the Exodus is to bring the people out of Egypt to go to the promised land that God was going to give to them. But then there's the nation promise that as they come into this land, as they come into this incubator of sorts, they are doing exactly what God has told them to do, that you need to multiply, grow strong, and become this strong nation, just as Adam and Eve were to be the great mother and father of the human race, that were to be image bearers of God, to reflect his image, that the whole human race was to be God's special people. Well, once that fails, based on what happens in Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, well, now what we have here is Abraham and Sarah taking on this new role as the new Adam and Eve, that they are now going to be the great mother and the great father of this special chosen people of God, and that this is going to be the special family of God, the special people of God. And as they're in this place, it should not surprise us that they are blessed as they are, that God would bring them down to this place for a purpose. And I want us to note, again, drawing connections from what Genesis says, going all the way back. Let's see here. Let's see. Whenever Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt, and Joseph reveals himself to them. Let's see here. Where we at here? Here we go. Chapter 45. As Joseph is talking with them about why this has all happened, in Genesis chapter 45 and verse number 5, don't be grieved or angry with yourself. This is Joseph speaking to his brothers after revealing who he is. Don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. Verse 7, God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household and ruler over the land of Egypt. That's the first time he says it. Then if we go to the end of Genesis, in verse number 24 of chapter 50, remember the brothers, or excuse me, not 24, verse number 19, the brothers are worried now that their father's dead, that Joseph's going to take out his actual revenge, that yes, he might have been showing love because of his father still being alive, but now that his father is dead, he might really do what he wants to do. But Joseph says to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Well, they weren't exactly many whenever they first came down in Genesis, but now we get here to the Exodus story, and that's exactly what they are. They are many. And that many is presenting a problem in the eyes of this new king, this new Pharaoh, that there is this family that has grown into a great people in the land of Goshen. And he's thinking, because where that's situated is going to be in the northeastern section of Egypt. And what he's thinking is that if anybody comes from that land, then what they're going to do is they're going to pick up these foreign people and they're going to join them. And once a war is commenced against us, it's not only going to be the invaders, but it's going to be this strong people that's already in our land, who already knows our customs and who knows everything about us, and we're going to be done for. So what's the best way to hold down a strong people? Well, it's to oppress them. It's to oppress them. It's to try to weaken them through this hard labor. And what I want to notice before we move on, Alan, unless you have something else, what I want to notice here is that God's plan here is being challenged. God's plan for his people to grow mighty and to grow strong and to multiply and to be a great people, it's being challenged by this Pharaoh, which is what we've seen already in the Bible story. That God's plan for mankind was challenged by the serpent in Genesis chapter 3. That God's plan was challenged by the sin that takes place in Genesis chapter 6. That God's plan is challenged in Genesis chapter 11. And here we have the next challenge, which is this Pharaoh, this king, trying to hold down God's people. And yet, as they try to hold down the people, what we read in verse number 12 is key. That the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Though they were trying to oppress, the power that was behind them in God was more than they could handle. Even through their oppression, the people of God were still blessed. Do you have anything you want to add on, Alan, before we move to the next section?
You mentioned when God's plan was challenged, specifically, I think there's a lot of callbacks to the Tower of Babel here in this first chapter. Notice in verse 11, they assigned taskmasters over them, and they built these cities. If you remember those first 12 chapters of Genesis, usually the ones that were building cities were the ones that were not doing what God wanted.
That's
Cain
right.
went and built a city. All of his descendants were building cities. Then after the flood, Noah's descendants were supposed to go out and be fruitful and multiply, like the children of Israel actually are doing here. They're actually following what God wanted, and God's plan was to be fruitful and multiply. They're doing that. But here's Egypt building this city on the backs of slaves. It even mentions how they used, they built brick and mortar. I mean, why would you mention these things except to remind us about how the people of Babel, were building these using bricks and mortar and all this stuff to build their city. So I think there's supposed to be a direct parallel to Babel, and that was really even more so than the sin. Babel was the first great, I think, rebellion that we read about. And even in Genesis chapter 6, it just talks about how wicked the people are. They were just doing wicked. It was just so prevalent. But this was in Babel, that was the first big, rebellion. I am putting my place, up there with God. I'm going to try to build this city up to God. And what happens? He comes down, and I think it even talks about how they didn't want to be scattered across the earth. So God comes and scatters them.
Right.
Well, what's going to happen here? Pharaoh, it doesn't want them to multiply further. And then what happens? And let's see. And then it talks about they still multiply. They still,
verse 12.
Verse 12, they couldn't stop. They multiplied and spread so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites, the more they oppressed them. So when wicked people, wicked kings are doing things against God, it always seems like he flips that on them completely. The thing that they're trying to avoid actually ends up happening. So Pharaoh is basically cast as another Babel in this instance, and I think parallels to the wicked people in chapter 6, or Satan the serpent in chapter 3 of Genesis. All those parallels tie to Pharaoh here. And as we keep going, it's interesting. There's actually different pharaohs that are going to be mentioned.
It's key, I believe, very key.
Like this Pharaoh is going to be different from the Pharaoh of the Exodus in a couple chapters later. There's just the time frame. It can't be the same one Pharaoh, but the point is that it's the country and the idea and the just the leadership there. And it's also key too that he's never given a name. It's just, Pharaoh is just the king, it's just like we said, the president, or,
right,
the king of England or something. I mean, we could be talking about any number of people. We don't have their actual name. And then what happens in verse 15? We actually get two names of pretty minor characters here that shouldn't have anything to do with anything, but we remember their names 5,000-6,000 years later, and we don't even know the Pharaoh that is talking and plays a major role in this whole story. So you understand, it's almost like the narrator's putting him in his place
100%
for doing and elevating someone that deserves to be elevated, these two midwives.
Right. The Pharaoh who would have seen himself as a deity, and who would have expected for those who lived within Egypt to respect him as a deity. We have no Pharaoh name here. We have no name of the Pharaoh. All he's referred to here in 1 and verse 8, chapter 1 and verse 8 is a king. And then in chapter 2 and verse 23, the king of Egypt died. That's key, I believe, as you're saying, to show the chronology of what's going on here, and just to show how some time has passed. But you're right. There's no name of the Pharaoh. There's no individual name given to him. But here we have two women who end up being heroes in this case. And let's read about those women and what takes place, because what we want to understand here, and I want to add this real fast before I get into that. What Alan and I are talking about and bringing up these continual themes and these tie-ins with the text is one of the things we really want to focus on in this kind of study, this walking through history, walking through his story. You're going to hear us on a number of times bring in past events that echo further down the line. So we've talked here about this standing up against God. We see that in Babel. We see that in Genesis 6. We see that in Genesis 3. Those kind of things are going to be seen throughout. And if that's something that interests you, I invite you to go back on our Facebook page here to our video section and join us in the studies that we've done in the past. And those will be on YouTube here in the not too distant future. Whenever I have some time to sit down and download all those and edit them and get them posted, that'll be on there for your viewing pleasure, I guess. Not really pleasure, but for your edification as well, so you catch up on what we've been doing here in the text. But here now in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 15, We want to read that the king, once the oppression didn't help, once that didn't take away the strength of the people, he's thinking, well, all I can do really now is try to affect the numbers. So this is how he does it in a horrific way. Exodus 1 and verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, the first whose name was Shiphrah, and the second whose name was Puah, when you help the women, the Hebrew women, give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, she may live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, and they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked him, why have you done this and let the boys live? And the midwife said to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very numerous. Since the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And Pharaoh then commanded all his people, you must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live. It's one of the, like I said, one of the more horrific sections in Scripture, and this is actually echoed in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the story of Jesus, in order to keep down what is seen to be a pending power. We see Herod there killing all the young boys in that land, and here we see happen the first time within Exodus. Alan, what do you see within this text that is significant to the story here, and what do you think about Shiphrah and Puah and their actions and God's reaction to what they did?
Well, you definitely mentioned Matthew chapter 2, verse, I think it's verse 16, when Herod is trying to kill, he's trying to find Jesus and have him killed. So he has all of the boys 2 years old and under in Bethlehem killed. I think the point of that story in Matthew is definitely, I mean, there's too many parallels to not think of this story here in Exodus. So that is supposed to show that Jesus is a deliverer, just like Moses will be a deliverer. Moses is born despite these difficult circumstances, someone trying to kill him. Well, Jesus is also born and survives despite the king trying to kill him. And he flees to Egypt. another little parallel there. So I think that in that story is supposed to, equate Jesus with Moses in a sense. But it's so interesting here. These two women, they were told, the child's born and you see a son, well, you kill him. And if you see a daughter, you don't kill him. I love their excuse because it doesn't change anything. They're like, oh, the Hebrew women, they have the baby, and before we even get there, well,
why couldn't they still kill
them? Why couldn't they still kill them?
What's the difference there? And so go ahead and give an explanation you might have.
Well, I mean, clearly they're just. I mean, I think this is more of a stalling. Some might see this as them telling some sort of lie, and I mean, maybe you could go that far, but clearly, even if they did lie in this sense, they are doing what's right. They fear God. They are blessed because of their actions here, and they are going against the king. So whether you could call them lying or they're just kind of stalling, trying to buy time, just kind of avoid trouble or whatever it is. I mean, they're clearly blessed because of their actions, and they're clearly not going to do this wicked thing. No, even the fact that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the most powerful person in the world, is telling them to do something, they still fear God. And I think this mindset also gives you a little bit of mindset of what the children of Israel were like. We've already seen that they're fruitful, they're increasing, they're multiplying, they're being blessed. We talked back in Genesis, this is a very dangerous time for them because they were so small early on that it would be easy for them to just assimilate into the culture around them and be swallowed up, just basically cease to exist as an entity. But clearly that has not happened. They have separated themselves enough from the Egyptians to where there's not enough intermarriage to completely, sever all, Israelite identity. And clearly here, these women, I think, represent at least a portion of the populace that is still fearing God and is still doing right. And this is still before before the covenant, before Moses, before the Ten Commandments. I mean, this is just based on their tradition, and of course they have the covenant of circumcision, so that kind of separates them in a way. But this is good to see that this group is still maintaining their uh, measure of holiness, I guess. And even during these difficult times, it would be easy for them to just give up and, hey, God's forgotten about us, whatever, let's just try to get through our life here. But I don't think that's quite happened yet.
Right. There's definitely still the distinctness between these people and the Egyptian people, that there is that fear that, listen, there's so many of them, they could rise up against us and be a detriment to us. I want to offer up an alternate way of seeing this particular section of chapter 1. And I heard it presented by Dr. Michael Heiser, who is a Hebrew scholar, an Old Testament scholar. He does a lot of work in kind of supernatural type writings within the Old Testament. But he gives an explanation that I have never heard before from this text, but it actually makes more sense to me. And it avoids kind of the conundrum that we might have between thinking, did these women lie? Or this is often the way that's presented. These women lied. How can God bless them for lying if we are always to tell the truth? Okay, that's the conundrum. So this is how he presents it, to show that there's really no conundrum. And it really comes from a way that the text has been translated, given the interpretation of a figure of speech that kind of leads this issue. This is what he says. He says that this text here, verses 16 through 19, 16, 17, 18, 19, notice that there is a change in command. So 16 or 15 through 19, the command is the way it says in the text. When you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. So that's the command. And the way we take that is, once they're in the delivery process, once they're in labor, and you see that, if you see it's a male, kill them. So that's the first part here. We'll look at the second part. Whenever the command is re-upped, you might say, it's kind of it's intensified. And it commands, you must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live. The question, how's that any different? How is it any different from the second command from the first command? So that's what Heiser says. And he's the scholar in the languages, so I can't really argue against it from that regard. But he says that line here that you see on the screen, let's see here, observe them as they deliver. He says that that's an idiom that means something differently in the Hebrew text than it does in every single English text. And he admits, he says, I don't know why the English text translate it in this way, because this just isn't it. He says that this particular phrase here, observe them as they deliver, is actually the exact same phrase that's found in Jeremiah 18 and verse 3. And Jeremiah 18 and verse 3 is the text concerning the potter's wheel. The text there where it talks about the Lord forming and bringing the people into formation. So his conclusion then is that really what you see here in verse 16 is a call for abortion. Now, for us, you're thinking, well, how could that be the case? Well, the reality is, if you go back in history, he says that history tells us that even in these times, there was still such thing as a prenatal exam, that they had ways to determine the sex of a child through different concoctions and stuff, the mixing of blood and such, that they could determine whether the child was a male or a female. So his claim then is that what this ought to say in reality is that when you're helping the Hebrew women give birth, when you're taking care of them in the pregnancy process, and when you do these exams, if you figure out that this is a male child, you need to perform an abortion so that this child is not born, which that then would make more sense, because the command then is to perform an abortion. Therefore, you kill the child while it's still in utero. But notice what they say. The child's already born. You didn't tell us to kill a live baby. You just told us to perform an abortion on a son. To me, that answers the question, why couldn't they still kill them? Well, they couldn't still kill them because that wasn't the command. The command was not to kill a child that had been born, but the command was to kill a child that was still in the womb through their prenatal type of exams, which then would lead to an easier understanding of, okay, well, he's gone now from you need to kill them in the womb to where you just need to kill them in general. That if they're born, now they have been born, now you need to just toss them in the river. To me, that makes sense. I mean, especially if him knowing the Hebrew language, there is that connection between observing them as they deliver and the potter's will. And if this technology, this advancement in medical technology was available to them, then to me, that makes sense here in this text. Now, whether that is accurate, completely accurate, I can tell you I'd have to do some more research and study into it. But to me, that makes the text make a little more sense. And it helps kind of things be a lot more smooth, things to be more smooth than they are often whenever we're left at this conundrum, trying to think about these women lying and God still blessing them and such. Alan, did you see any of that, anything you were doing? I don't know if you were listening to Heiser's podcast or not, but that's what he said in his observations of this text.
Yeah, I like that. That makes sense.
I think it makes total sense.
Mm-hmm. Look at verse 22. I think it's interesting too. Where Pharaoh's mentioned a lot, but several times it's also the Egyptian people that are participating in these wicked things. Earlier on, verse 11, the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites. So they were, it wasn't just Pharaoh and the Egyptians were like, oh, we shouldn't, make them slaves. The Egyptians were part of this. Well, same here too. Pharaoh commands his people, you must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile. Well, clearly, based on what happens in chapter 2, Pharaoh's daughter sees a child floating down the Nile and she just assumes it's a Hebrew baby. Well, why does she assume that? Because it's probably happened before. So Pharaoh can't go and find every Hebrew, Pharaoh himself can't do that, but he was getting his people involved and they were involved as well. So I think going back to why we don't know Pharaoh's name, like, yes, he's the villain of the story, but it is the nation of Egypt that is following his lead. Mm-hmm. And that's why they suffer just as much as he does in the plagues later on.
Right. So we take this whole chapter, then this first chapter of Exodus, it does set itself completely in contrast to what we see at the end of Genesis. In the Genesis, the people of God are in Egypt. They're blessed. They are well taken care of. They're in a position of honor in a sense because of Joseph and the man he was, the position he held in Egypt. Yet we get here to Exodus, and yes, there is some positive language in the fact that they are increasing rapidly. They're fruitful. They're multiplying. They're extremely numerous. The land is filled with them, and yet the circumstances surrounding their numerical growth are not positive. Very negative. There is great punishment almost that is being handed out by the Egyptians. Even death is called for from Pharaoh himself. And once the Hebrew midwives don't cooperate with that, then he delivers that command to the whole of the Egyptian people. So what are the people to do? They are under the hand of oppression. Things are not looking up for them. The circumstances have taken a complete 180 in regards to the way they're living in Egypt, their existence here, their livelihood here. What are the people to do? What are God's people to do at such a time? And this is what God's people are. I shouldn't say this is what God people are going to do. This is what God does. God seeks now to raise up a deliverer, and it comes in the form of Moses. Exodus chapter 2 and verse 1 says that a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman, and the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the banks of the Nile, by the bank of the Nile. And then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl and took it, opened it, and saw him, the child. And there he was, a little boy crying. And she felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Alan, what a coincidence. What a coincidence.
What a series of coincidences.
That's a great point. What a series of coincidences that this boy born to this Levite family would just somehow find its way into Pharaoh's household and somehow find its way back into his own household, only to be delivered back as a daughter of Pharaoh. I think there's a word here for what's going on, Alan. What might that word be?
A little bit of providence, I think
here. I think so.
The verse 7 kind of starts that. Just, okay, he survives 3 months. That's, not out of the realm of possibility. She makes a little basket and he floats down the Nile. If you watch all the movies, he's floating down the Nile and about to get eaten by an alligator. I don't think that happens. I think he's just floating down a calm river.
Crocodile, I believe. Crocodile.
But yeah, crocodile. But to happen upon the daughter of Pharaoh, and then the sister, I think, shows some faith here. For her to just, announce herself, say, "Hey, should I go call a Hebrew woman?" I mean, this is the princess of Egypt, and she's a slave girl. So that's pretty bold of her to even talk to Pharaoh's daughter this way. But to suggest, to be bold enough to suggest what she does is again, just, God's hand in all of this. And then the fact that, Pharaoh's daughter, I do find it a little hard to believe that Pharaoh's daughter didn't know that this was the boy's actual mother. I feel like she would have known that, and to her credit, she allows that to happen. I mean, makes sense, she's, Pharaoh's fine with killing a bunch of baby boys. Not everyone in Egypt would have been okay with that, even if they just kind of went along with it. So she had compassion on him, and it worked out good that it was Pharaoh's, that Moses' actual mother basically gets to raise him and take care of him just as she would, and she gets paid for it too. That's pretty sweet deal. So if anyone wants to pay me for raising my 2 kids, then I'll take it here.
Or are you trying to say that Melanie's not doing a good enough job, Alan? Is that
pay us both? Pay us both. I don't care. Pay her, pay me. I don't care.
I can hear Melanie now. Oh,
what's mine is hers. What's hers is mine. So.
Well, you do have 2 beautiful little children, and we do love them very, very much. And I'm sure Lincoln will be a great addition to the little child horde we have running around the church house once we're able to finally get back together again in some sense of normalcy. He'll have a big group to definitely play with and help raise them up.
That word you just mentioned, beautiful. I think that's a beautiful word for right there. Mm-hmm. That just seems. I mean, there's a ton of meaning you can throw in there. When she saw that he was beautiful, I think later on in Acts, when Stephen's recounting this story, he mentions that when God saw that he was a beautiful child. So it's not just the mom seeing he's beautiful; it's God seeing he's beautiful, and this has nothing to do with the way he looked. I mean, I've just had a newborn; they're not the most beautiful things in the world. So, but they are, in the sense of, they are precious in God's sight. They are, I mean, you would give your life to save that newborn. And she really was. She was risking her life for 3 months to try to hide him. And that's why in Hebrews, when it talks about, by faith, it doesn't say by faith Moses, it's by faith Moses' parents were hid him for 3 months. I mean, they are listed, not by name in Hebrews, but his mom and dad are listed in the hall of faith right next to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob,
Right.
Noah, all those, Moses himself. I mean, they are
Mhm.
listed there. So this is a great act of faith on her part.
Absolutely. My Bible gives a couple of notes here. That word beautiful could also be translated good, and it draws echoes back to Genesis 1, where the Lord himself saw his creation and he notes it as being good. The same thing could be said here of Moses' mother and himself, that she saw him and saw it was good. And just as the Lord sought to provide for his new creation, so here Moses' mother does everything she can to provide for him and to try to save his life. And it working out well. And of course, we attribute so much of that to the providence of God, allowing him to be raised in this way. And again, he's raising him for a purpose, and the purpose is going to become more clear as we work our way through the text, beginning in verse 11, where the text says that years later, where we go here, years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people, and looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor? Who made you a commander and judge over us?" The man replied, "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." And when Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And then some shepherds arrived and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. And when they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, "Why have you come back so quickly today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "So where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave the man behind? Invite him to eat dinner." And Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his wife Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a resident alien in a foreign land." And after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out. And their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. And God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. Alan, it is made pretty clearly, we're off the bat, the type of man that Moses is. He seems to be a protector of sorts, a deliverer. And that characteristic is what ends up driving him from Egypt, or it also helps to land him in a good position. It seems so incredible to me that God just knows people. I guess it shouldn't be incredible to me, but it is incredible to see how time and time again God chooses the exact right type of person, even though they might not think they're the right type of person, foreshadowing to chapter 3. But God knows the exact right type of person to fill each spot he needs in his plan being carried out. And we see that here with Moses.
What's interesting, well, first off, this definitely is completely been altered. This narrative, this story has completely been altered in modern movies and media. Every single Moses story I've seen is, Moses grows up, he's grown up as an Egyptian, and then as an adult, he realizes that he's a Hebrew and, figures it out then. I think that's completely false. I think he is told exactly who he is and what he is from day one by his mom, and he grows up knowing that he's a Hebrew. And I like verse 14. The man says, "Who made you a commander and judge over us?" I think he viewed himself as that deliverer from almost day one, from an early age. He said, "Hey, I'm in a unique position to save my people." He thought he was that deliverer. And you mentioned God choosing the exact right person. This is not the Moses that delivers Israel. He's probably about 40 years old at this point when he kills the Egyptians. This is a Moses that He's got great skills. He's grown up in Pharaoh's house. He clearly has knowledge, intellect, fighting skills. I mean, he was able to kill an Egyptian. He obviously he probably practice sword fighting or practice the art of warfare. Like he has great skills, just like any prince of Egypt would. This is not the man that God uses to deliver Israel. What does he do? He sends Moses. I mean, Moses flees from Egypt because he's afraid of getting killed. He flees to Midian, and we'll see he spends 40 years in Midian. So 40-year-old Moses was not the one to deliver Israel. It's 80-year-old Moses after being away from Egypt for 40 years. And we'll see, I think that gave him time to be humble. I don't see a humble Moses right here because clearly even the Israelites saw like, oh, you think you're all that in a bag of chips because you're a Hebrew, but you grew up in Pharaoh's house. I don't think they respected him that much. Which how could they? I mean, he gets to avoid all of the trouble. He gets to live in luxury, and then he thinks he's gonna just lead the people and they're gonna follow. No, it's not that person that is the right deliverer. It's someone that has gone through hardship at 40 years of hardship and learned how he's going to be a shepherd and water his father's flocks, or his father-in-law. So he's a different person by chapter 3 when he's about 80 years old than he is here, 40-year-old Moses.
Yeah, that is a good point, because how could it be that he would go from this type of behavior to the behavior that we see in chapter 3, where he says, "Oh, well, not me. I'm not a leader. I'm not even a great talker. I'm not your guy." What changed? I think there's screams what you're saying. What changed is the fact that he was sent out from this place. He was relegated from this place of privilege to having to live out in a separate land. I mean, we even go to the name of his son. I've been a resident alien in a foreign land. We see him recognizing that aspect about him, about himself in this new position that he finds himself in. And I want to just draw another connection here between what we see with Moses and the new circumstances. Remember going back to chapter 2 in verse number 1, Moses here is referred to as beautiful. If you look at the name of his new wife, Zipporah, her name means beautiful or beauty. So that's just a little connection there. Let's see here. We have these, if we're just reading this text for the first time, Moses here is set up as a deliverer figure. And that is, again, that's what he eventually becomes, though he becomes that deliverer, as you say, having a different mindset at that time, not wanting to be that deliverer. I mean, not wanting to step up, but it's inescapable the fact that he is one. And the story is setting him up to be that way, but he's going to be that way with a different mindset, not with this mindset of, I'm the guy. No, the Lord says, you're the guy. You're the one that is going to be this deliverer. Well, why? The question might be, well, why is there a need for Moses to take up this position to begin with? Well, it's because of what we see at the end of this chapter, that after a long time, we see those timestamps back in verse 11 years later, and verse 23, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. So that means there's two different pharaohs at play here, as you mentioned before. There's the pharaoh of Moses' upbringing, and there's a new pharaoh in the Exodus. Now, does that mean that's just one pharaoh moved, two pharaohs moved? Well, we don't know for certain, but it is a different pharaoh. We know that for certain. There's a different pharaoh. Which one? That is that comes with uncertainty. But once that pharaoh dies, that king dies, notice the Israelites groaned because they're difficult labor, and they cried out in their cry for help. And they cried out for help because of difficult labor, and that is send it to God. I want to notice what the text says, that God remembered. Not that God forgot, but God remembered. What did he remember? His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. Alan, what did God know? And that's such an awkward way, to end this chapter. Just, and God knew. Well, God knew what?
I liken this to actually First John, when it talks about, that which we have, seen with our eyes, heard with our ears, we've touched. They're talking about, John, the apostle, is talking about he knew, he saw, he experienced Jesus. He was there. He knew all of that. There was nothing. There was nothing that he didn't understand. He was an eyewitness. So who better to write about or to talk about Jesus than someone that was right there? Well, look at all of these words that show God's complete understanding of the situation. He heard, he saw, and he knew. And because of those things, he is in complete understanding of the situation. So it's now that is the time to deliver his people. And talking about some kind of big themes, Moses really, his early life up to this point is going to be a mirror for the path of the Israelites. Think about it. His name means to draw out. Pharaoh's daughter gives him the name Moses, drawn out, because she drew him out of the water. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen to Israel from Egypt. God is going to, the Israelites do not leave. God draws them out. And draws them out from the water of the Red Sea. He draws them out, and then what do? They spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Well, what has Moses been doing? He's spent 40 years in the wilderness of Midian. So his path up to this point is preparing him for the path that Israel is going to take over the next several chapters, as they are drawn out of Egypt, and then their wanderings for so long. But all this language is clearly God's hand in all of this. This is nothing that Israel can do. They were not able to leave Egypt without God drawing them out. Even and Moses as well. I mean, all of this, he would not have survived without God's hand in all of this, because God knew, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that sends us back to all those times that he talks about a covenant, and even mentions that they would, even in Genesis, it was foretold that they would spend a long time in Egypt, and that they would that they would serve the king down there. So this is all foretold, even to Abraham back in the day. I think chapter 15, if I remember. So all of this was nothing that God didn't expect. None of this was something that, like you said, this isn't that he forgot. This was all part of the plan. And now that the deliverer is ready, Moses is, of the right age and temperament to deliver. Now that plan can begin, starting in chapter 3.
Right, Genesis 15 and verse 13, the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain. Funny, know this. What do we see back here? God knew, he saw, he remembered, which is funny because straight across the page is chapter 3 and verse number 7, where he says, I know. Well, know what? Know, Genesis 15 and verse 13, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. This was something that was foretold by God, and we find it here in this text, surely coming to pass. If God ordains it, it is going to happen. Even as others stand up against him, it's still going to happen.
Scroll down to chapter 3, verse 7. So with verse 24, it mentions he heard, he saw, he knew, he remembered. Well, look at verse 7. I have observed, I saw the misery of my people. I heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their suffering. Mm-hmm. So just a perfect parallel verse right there.
Absolutely. Well, for those who are on Zoom, do you guys have any comments or questions that you would like to? Let me get you unmuted in case you would like to. Do you have any comments or questions that from our study that you would like to ask or make note of right now?
one of the things that you see in chapters 1 and 2 that follow throughout the rest of Exodus is the subverted expectations. The expectation that Pharaoh had in oppressing the people was that their numbers would not increase. Well, God subverted their expectations because, again, God rules in the kingdoms of men, and so his people grow. Then we have God subverting the expectation of Pharaoh in minimizing their numbers by the command for the midwives to execute the children in birth, and God subverts the expectation through the midwives being obedient and fearing God. Then you have the command for the Hebrew people to cast their boys into the river. Well, Pharaoh's command is subverted by, I think Alan kind of mentioned it a little bit, that it was probably a more common occurrence that they would build little arks for their children.
That's good.
And so it wouldn't be uncommon for Pharaoh's daughter to see these boys floating down the river instead of the bodies. And so again, you see throughout the book of Exodus, the expectations of men being subverted and God demonstrating his control. One of the things that you're going to see in the plagues, and I don't want to forecast too much, is how much Pharaoh's expectations are subverted. The expectation of his magicians to be able to duplicate the plagues, and how some they're able to, but it's again not to the same degree, because it shows again God's almighty power versus the limited power of these gods, and how they trust in these gods for life and everything. And in one of the plagues, you see literal gods dead on the ground covering everything. And so again, it just shows God's almighty power.
Yeah, I mean, we go back to the garden again. We always seem to find ourselves going back to the garden. Go back to the garden. Satan put up the temptation. If you eat of this fruit, you'll be like gods, knowing both good and evil. And Eve and Adam, they eat that fruit. And you would think that in their moment, in their mind, they think, okay, whenever I eat this, something's going to change. And I'm going to be this incredible supernatural being, and I'm just going to know everything. And then what happens? When they eat the fruit, their eyes are opened, but what do they see? All they see is their nakedness. They don't see this supernatural power now flowing through their veins. They just see their nakedness before God. Yeah, we often have these great expectations, thinking that whatever we do is going to turn out well for us. But if it's not according to the will of God, we should not be surprised whenever things don't exactly go as planned. Dwayne, you got any comments? Got any thoughts you want to share? Let's see if I can get him unmuted.
There we go. Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, the only thing that I had was I was really, I hadn't thought about the difference between Moses at 40 and Moses at 80, which I think is really interesting. I've never caught that before.
That's why Alan gets paid the big bucks, Dwayne.
I'm telling you, way to go, Alan, because, you think about it, he leaps in and kills some guy and starts running around, and so much that they rebuke him. It does seem like he thought he was going to be their, he was going to be their deliverer at that point. But they like the older people. God, you put some years on you, and you might be a little bit more ready to handle what God had planned there. So take that for what it's worth.
I would say not just the older people, but God always seems to choose someone that goes against what we would think. We would expect a strapping 40-year-old. I mean, that's I think of Saul. Saul was the tallest of all the people, head and shoulders above everyone. He's going to be a great king. Well, that ends in disaster. Who does God choose? It's David, this little runt of a kid. And but God was looking at his heart. So Moses, he was that strapping guy, I think, but it's 80-year-old Moses who is considered the meekest man alive. We'll see later on. He's just called meek. That's not a leadership role that we would want to follow, but that's exactly the type of person that God chooses to deliver his people. And as we wrap up, I wanted to I showed Nick this quote from Wiersbe as we kind of think about the bigger picture of the coming chapters and the coming books. It said Exodus tells us how God got his people out of Egypt, and it begins to tell us how God got Egypt out of his people.
Yeah.
So for about 15 chapters, it's going to be the plagues and then the Red Sea getting Israel out of Egypt. Well, then from Exodus about 19 through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the bulk of the rest of these books is going to be how God made them holy. And I think that's what we see in the New Testament as well. We really don't see too much text. I mean, we see the four gospels talking about the great deliverance, which was, Jesus on the cross. Well, then we have, let's see, 27, so 23 more books after that, I think, teaching us how to be Christians, how to be holy people. And that is because that's most important to us. We need to know how we were delivered, how we need to know about Christ. We need to know about the cross. But more importantly to us right now is how to be holy and what to do with that deliverance throughout the rest of our lives. So that's exactly the pattern that we see here in the Pentateuch with the first 5 books of the Bible. And we'll see that in the New Testament as well. God desires a holy people because, as we'll see in chapter 3, God is holy. Moses is going to be standing on holy ground. So he desires a holy people as well.
Right. It is the whole story that we have here, Alan, is God creating us exactly as he wants us in the beginning. And then once we fall from that position, the story is about restoration and redemption. And exactly what you're talking about. This is God reforming a people for himself. We're included in that. We are to be a reformed people, a changed people who are not conformed to this world, but we are transformed. We're made different by Jesus and by God and by his Spirit, so that we can be what he desired for us to be in the beginning, which are image bearers, reflecting his character, reflecting him and everything that he is about. And that's what we're going to continue to look at as we continue to walk through history, continue to walk through his story, the story of the Bible. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for those who are on Facebook who have joined us in this study. Thank you for those who are on Zoom. Chris and Dwayne are here with us on Zoom, giving us your comments here at the end. We're so appreciative for you doing so. And if you have enjoyed this study, if you found it beneficial, then we do invite you to join us as we regularly present these studies on Tuesdays and Fridays. We'll be doing them a little later in the day over the next couple of weeks because voting has started, and I help out here in Madison County with the election process. So we'll be doing our studies at 5 p.m. this upcoming Friday, and we'll do that, I guess, as far as that goes for the next couple of weeks as I'm dealing with that as well here and scheduling plans, make sure all that works out together. Look forward to our page. I'll post reminders and set scheduled live streams for those times. And if you are someone who prefers to not be on Facebook, or if you have someone who would like to join in on this study and they don't have Facebook, again, Chris is doing a great job of helping me set up a YouTube channel and getting the streaming down for that. So I'll be sharing a link to where you could go to YouTube, where you don't have to have an account. You don't have to have Facebook, don't have to have anything like that. You just click on a link and you'll be able to watch this stream and participate with us in this study. Thank you also very much. Alan, do you have anything to close with this evening?
Just glad to be back. It's kind of been a long couple of weeks without our study, so I'm happy to get started with Exodus again.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan does such a great job. He's very learned and puts in a lot of time in order to share with us many of these things. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us again. Have a great rest of your evening. God bless you. And we look forward to you joining us on this upcoming Friday at 5 p.m. as we continue to walk through history, walk through his story, the story of God. Everybody take care. God bless.